The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Steve Knievel, an advocate for public citizens' access to medicines program, focusing on expanding affordable access to medicines. Steve Knievel, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
Certainly our pleasure to have you with us, Steve. And, you know, Democrats recently announced a deal on drug pricing reform in the Build Back Better Act. What do we know about what may be included in the bill on this issue?
So there's three main pillars of the sorts of reforms that the Democrats are considering including in Build Back Better. So one is the long-sought Medicare drug price negotiation. Number two is providing price spike protections for certain drugs, but those protections would extend beyond patients on Medicare to consumers throughout the United States. And then finally, some out-of-pocket protections. $2,000 out-of-pocket cap for Medicare beneficiaries on Part D, which would help about 1 million plus people in a given year, probably. And an out-of-pocket cap specifically for insulin of $35 per month, which policymakers are attempting to extend beyond Medicare to commercial plans as well. But to be clear, you know, that measure would just be impacting what patients pay out of pocket rather than the price that drug companies charge for insulin.
So when details of the Democrats' drug pricing agreement were released, Public Citizen issued a statement calling it a step forward, but with the caveat that Americans deserve more. And I think maybe this is where you're heading with that last answer. First of all, what makes this deal a step forward?
Yeah, so I mean, for the reasons I just mentioned, with the policies I just mentioned, you know, there are going to be millions of people throughout the country that are provided with relief from the high prices that they face at the pharmacy counter for prescription drugs. That's one and probably the most important piece. So there's going to be a lot of people that are helped, no longer facing difficult decisions between, you know, paying their rent, paying for groceries, or filling their prescription. Now, you know, we're also securing somewhat lower prices for some drugs on Medicare, but that's far more limited in the sorts of impacts that we're having on the prices that we pay overall, you know, holistically, including through our premiums, not just our out-of-pocket costs. You know, where there are certain pharma-friendly members of Congress who, you know, throughout the negotiation process over the contents of this bill, have eroded what House Democrats previously unanimously agreed on 2 years ago in the form of H.R. 3, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act. And they made changes that limit how many drugs are negotiated, have the price negotiated by the U.S. government. They limit for whom those price negotiations apply, who has access to those lower negotiated prices by the U.S. government. And they changed, you know, overall the depth of the impact of the prices of the drugs that they do negotiate. So changing, you know, how much lower are we going to secure our drug prices? How much savings are we going to realize? So those are all, and one last thing, slightly outside the drug pricing space, I'd be remiss not to mention how the savings realized are used. So progressives the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Public Citizen, many other organizations have been advocating for a large portion of the savings accrued to the federal government from drug price negotiations and other reforms from Build Back Better to be used towards Medicare coverage expansion. So providing meaningful benefits for dental, vision, and hearing, trying to lower the eligibility age for enrolling in Medicare, finally getting in place an overall out-of-pocket cap for Medicare. These are all reforms that we've been seeking, and as of now, it seems that we're only going to get, less than a half loaf, some sort of, limited hearing benefits, and maybe nothing on dental or vision.
So there's your small step forward. In what ways does this bill, though, fall short of what Americans want and deserve?
Right. So we could get more drugs negotiated. We could have people with commercial plans benefit from negotiated prices. We could seek to bring our prices more in line with those paid in other large wealthy countries versus just somewhat lower prices than the excessive prices that we pay here and now. And we could secure deeper out-of-pocket protections for beneficiaries too in Medicare and for people outside Medicare. As I referenced at the top, the $2,000 out-of-pocket cap for Medicare Part D, that people are estimating that will benefit about 1.2 or 1.3 million beneficiaries in a given year. But there's more than 40 million people enrolled in Medicare Part D. A lot of those people face high out-of-pocket costs too, even if they don't reach that 2,000 level. Those 1.2 million people or so are those who are most in need of that kind of relief on Medicare. But we need to expand that much further too, and beyond Medicare for that matter.
Yeah, and you've got given it's you got a lot more people heading that direction now as the baby boomer are still, we're still a part of this conversation, and not everyone is there yet, and so there's still more to come.
I'll tell you one I left out one extremely impactful but somewhat wonky sort of issue at play too. So Scott Peters, one of the pharma-friendly Democrats in the House, and some of his friends were successful in limiting the negotiations only to drugs that have been on the market for a certain period of time. So, previously Peters and company were advocating for no negotiations on patented drugs whatsoever, which would mean a very long time before drugs could face price negotiations. And that would be very gameable, in which, some drugs might not face negotiations at all. But this other limitation that they have in place, it's still going to be, more than a decade before or after some drugs are on the market before they are eligible for facing drug price negotiations. So there's a lot of excessive pricing that can take place over that period of time. What the negotiations will do is they'll especially help limit pricing abuses of products that have been on the market for a very long time, where companies have been successful in sort of gaming the patent system and other rules to secure their monopolies for longer and longer. Well, this will help with those sorts of products, but there are still going to be very high launch prices for all products, despite this bill going into effect. Knock on wood.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, drug pricing reform has been one of the most contentious issues between moderate and progressive Democrats during the Build Back Better Act negotiations. What makes it so? You would think that we would be a little bit more in line with each other, moderates and progressives.
It is somewhat staggering, and there's a simple answer to it, and it is the power of the pharmaceutical industry. They are arguably the most powerful lobby in Washington. They employ, more than 1,000 lobbyists on this issue right now. Last number I saw, there was something like 1,600 lobbyists working on drug pricing reform and Build Back Better, and not on the right side, trying to weaken it. And that's really, frankly, it. the polling on this issue is remarkable. Like, there is vast policy consensus across the political spectrum, from your most liberal progressive Democrats to your most conservative Republicans and independents. Really across the political spectrum, polling has showed over years that there is consensus around the obvious measure of the government negotiated the prices that we pay under Medicare. So it's only when pharma throws its massive coffers at ad campaigns, at lobbying, at campaign-related activity, that we see a position where, despite this level of consensus, where there is more people that agree on drug pricing reform and Medicare drug price negotiation than the fact that the Earth rotates around the sun, quite literally. But yet our policymakers aren't fully following through with as much as they could do on that with that level of consensus. It is a demonstration of the industry's power.
All right, now, Steve, Big Pharma consistently makes the argument that drug pricing reform will come at the expense of innovation. We've been hearing this for a long time. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, you're right to point out that we've been hearing about it a long time, because it is literally what the drug industry raises anytime you try and touch 1 cent of their revenues. What they don't tell you is the massive amount of support for research and development that is funded by we, the public, American taxpayers, to the tune of more than $40 billion with a B annually through the National Institutes of Health. Most of that money goes out to universities, other sort of research centers. But the underlying funding comes from us. What they don't tell you is how much they spend, the companies themselves spend on research and development relative to how much they spend on making returns to shareholders through, just manipulations of the market through stock buybacks and dividends, which have no impact on innovation. They do more of that. The top Fortune 500 or S&P 500 rather, drug companies literally spend more on buybacks and dividends than they do on R&D. That was the case in the preceding decade. They don't tell you about how much they actually spend on research and development either. They give you sort of opaque, inflated estimates of risk-adjusted amounts that R&D costs, and then they try and double count it and exaggerate how much they actually need for research and development. So, long story short, there are lots of things that we're doing to ensure that innovation will continue, and that there's quite a lot that we can do to lower prices significantly without reducing the amount of meaningful innovation that we get for new products that help people.
Going forward, it seems clear that whatever remains in the Build Back Better Act, it will not resolve the issue of drug prices. So what would your message be to lawmakers on how to keep fighting for reform?
Well, first of all, they should continue to recognize how important this is to their constituents, how popular it is for their constituents, how much their constituents are depending on them getting this done, given that politicians have been promising this for quite a long time. I would also remind them that that's the case even as drug company lobbyists are in their offices hounding them, that popular sentiment is much more important, and that they have an opportunity to help people. So, the general message would just be telling them what they already know, that they just need to be reminded that they're in a position to make an important impact on one of the issues that's most important to people across this country, and that they should do that.
Okay. Steve Knievel, advocate for Public Citizens Access to Medicines program, which focuses on expanding affordable access to medicines. Steve, we appreciate you joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Would love that, Jim. Thank you again.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
For $3.5 trillion a year, shouldn't we Americans have a world-class healthcare system? Yet, while we spend the most of any advanced nation in the world to get care, more than $10,000 a year per person, we get the worst results. No surprise, then, that the Medicare for All idea is now backed by 85% of Democrats, 66% of independents, and, get this, 52% of Republicans. So why isn't Congress responding to this overwhelming public demand for universal coverage? I suspect that one big reason for Washington's big yawn over the people's plea for sweeping reform is that our lawmakers do not personally feel the financial pain and emotional distress that are inflicted on millions of regular Americans by a system built on private greed. After all, their health needs are met by a double dose of the socialistic care that they so furiously deny to our families. First, they're given big taxpayer subsidies to cover the cost of their insurance, with you and me paying about 72% of the price. But second, there's a secretive medical center located right in the U.S. Capitol building that provides a full-blown system of healthcare socialism to our governing elites. Called the OAP, Office of the Attending Physician, it provides a complete range of free medical service for lawmakers. No appointment needed and no waiting. They walk in and doctors, nurses, technicians, pharmacists, and other professionals tend to them right away. No need to show an insurance card, and they never get a bill. But they do get what a former OAP staffer calls the best health care on the planet. Thus, members feel no urgency to restructure a system that's working beautifully for them. This is Jim Hightower saying, so to get good care for all of us, we might start by taking away the pampered care that lawmakers have awarded to themselves.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
Justice Breyer announcing his decision to leave the bench. He's been there 27 years. Will he leave his mark on the Supreme Court? What do you see as his legacy?
Yeah, I think, certainly he will be known for his, his attention to the way in which the law affects real people and the way that the law works in real life. He was known for asking these very long questions at oral argument. I think some people would count like how many pages of the transcript his questions would go on. But I think what they really get to is his concern with the way in which, rulings that can seem very abstract when they're handed down by this high court and its marble palace, how these rulings affect real people. And, from the very beginning of his Supreme Court career, during his confirmation hearings, Justice Breyer said, the law must work for the people. And I think that, it's very fitting that part of his legacy will be that by retiring at this point, he opens his seat up for the first Black woman Supreme Court justice, who will, I think, even enrich further the understanding by our Supreme Court justices of how the law must work for the people.
Well, first of all, you mentioned his participation in the oral arguments, as the great Adam Liptak from the New York Times reported this week. Breyer was known for asking some really kind of funny or peculiar questions, not just long, right? But like getting into things like the marshmallow gun, or the pussycat burglar.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was definitely a character, and I think that for court watchers, we certainly enjoyed that aspect of things. He's an intellectual. He's someone who, wrote a lot of books when he was on the bench, who was interested in, really specific aspects of the law that could be seen as a little idiosyncratic. But I think it's important to remember that he also worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee as counsel. He has a really rich background in some of the more rough and tumble parts of, the way these things work, which I think a lot of us can forget given the way he asked these very kind of erudite, sometimes somewhat out there kinds of questions. But he definitely understood and I think hoped to embrace the idea of looking at the law affecting real people in their everyday lives in a substantial way.
I interviewed the justice a couple of times, and he also talked a lot about consensus, about following the facts, about making the law work, as you say, for ordinary people. It almost seems like a little old-fashioned. I'm not saying it's wrong, but does it meet the tenor of the times, I guess?
That's a really good question. And I think that, in some ways his legacy will be a focus on his attempts to build consensus, even though he did pen from time to time, sharp dissents. But, especially in the last year or so, he did make public statements about the need to see the court as beyond politics, as an institution that isn't full of politicians in robes, as many people like to think of it. And in some ways, that did kind of put him out of step a little bit with, I think, the current thinking about the court, which is that it's often hard to think of, this hard right 6-3 conservative majority court as not following a political ideological agenda. And, Justice Sotomayor, I think, said it really well in an oral argument comment in the abortion cases about, whether the courts could survive the stench of some of these really radical conservative rulings. And so some of Justice Breyer's, I think, demeanor and comments were a little out of step with that. But I think his decision to retire, and pave the way for this historic first, and pave the way for President Biden to make sure that, we get a nominee on the court who will be committed to equal justice for all is important.
So he obviously enjoyed his role. You've talked to him. I've talked to him. He loved speaking about the court, as you point out, writing about the court. Why did he resign?
I mean, I think that, look, there's, when everyone thinks about retirement, you get to a certain age and you think about retirement. And I think he was certainly at that age. I think his brother, District Court Judge Breyer, gave an interview saying, look, he lives on planet Earth and he's certainly aware of political realities of which president, might replace him and whether there's a Senate that might confirm a replacement. So I don't think that, I think you'd be foolish to say he didn't think of those things. I just think it was time for him to retire, at some point relatively soon. And this seemed like a good moment. And certainly we will gain the benefit, I'm sure, of him continuing to speak on the law and the court. I can't imagine he would criticize the court too much in his retirement, but we certainly will still gain the benefit of his intellect.
Particularly after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, giving Donald Trump an opportunity to make another appointment to the court. There was a public public pressure campaign launched to get Justice Breyer not to do the same thing, not to die on the court, right? And have a president from another party appoint his replacement. Even that truck that I saw all around Washington, going around with the big sign on it, "Retire Breyer." Do you think that public campaign had any impact?
Well, I don't think it had any impact on Justice Breyer's decision. If anything, I think it might have, made him think maybe I should dig in my heels. Yeah. But I do think it had an impact in the public thinking about the court. And to that extent, I think that it's positive for the general public to be engaged with the court. And, when people say they don't want the court to be political, well, it's true that we don't want the justices on the bench to make decisions based on their own personal political agenda. But the way in which we select justices is inherently political because they're nominated by a president who is elected by the people. They're confirmed or not by senators who are elected by the people. Right. And so it's appropriate to think, about that political part because, folks on the right have been thinking for a long time when they cast their votes at the ballot box about how it affects the court. And so I think, engaging progressives on this same subject, that part of it, I think, was positive.
So now we get to the process to seat a new justice of the Supreme Court. And we've seen it kind of the pendulum swing from 98 to nothing for Antonin Scalia, right? To what was barely for Amy Coney Barrett. How is this going to play out, do you believe?
I certainly think it will be, along similar party lines, even if it shouldn't be. President Biden has a deep bench of incredibly qualified candidates to choose from. And, the names that have put out people who have stellar credentials, excellent reputations. But, I don't think that necessarily means that they will get all the votes that they should. But, there are some folks in this pool of potential nominees like Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who she was confirmed just recently to the D.C. Circuit with some Republican votes. And, while I think some on the left have had problems with certain senators from the Democratic Party not always going along with the party line, I think that when it comes to judicial nominations, frankly, the Biden administration's efforts on judges have, it has been a resounding success, both in the terms of getting the people confirmed in the Senate and the quality of folks that they've put on the bench who are diverse in every possible way and break the mold, I think, in important ways when it comes to making sure that we have civil rights lawyers on the bench, people who worked in public defenders' offices on the bench. So, I certainly see it probably breaking down around political lines, whether or not it should, but also continuing that line of success that the administration has had with judicial nominees so far.
Fast or slow? I must say I was amused when some Republicans were saying, let's not rush into this, right? Let's take our time. Compared to how they handled the last one. But
yeah, I mean, look, I think for every nominee, this is a lifetime appointment to the bench. And so I think it's appropriate to make sure that we have, the appropriate process. But, it's an appropriate process. It's not an unduly drawn out process. If folks in opposition want to engage in shenanigans, I don't think that's appropriate. Obviously there needs to be enough time to have the Senate provide its constitutional advice and consent function as they should for any nominee. But there's, the idea of dragging it out, I think is, probably just political hardball and not really about what they need in order to give their advice or consent.
I don't know whether you had a chance to see, but Stephanie Cutter, who was in, of course, the Obama White House, with an op-ed in the New York Times on Monday morning of this week saying Democrats ought to learn from the Republicans when it comes to seating a Supreme Court justice and get it done as fast as they can.
I mean, I certainly think that it's important to get this done, expeditiously. Like I said, I think it needs to be the appropriate process because there is a constitutional role for the Senate to play. But, especially if it's someone who's been recently confirmed, that shouldn't take that long. And, I think that we've seen in recent years, as, Stephanie points out, that, you can get through a nomination relatively quickly, especially if there aren't any big problems that arise. I mean, look, I think on the other hand, I think a lot of us wish there would have been more process when it came to Justice Kavanaugh's nomination. But I don't foresee any of those issues coming with this nominee. And so I think you go with the appropriate amount of process. And I think we all know when that's appropriate. We also can see with our own two eyes when shenanigans are going on.
You have referred a couple of times to the person who's going to replace Justice Breyer. We don't know who she is, but we know she is a she, and she will be the first African-American woman nominated to the Supreme Court. Why is that so important? Biden, of course, promised it as a candidate and has since, as president, repeated and confirmed his intention. Why is that so important, looking at the court's history?
I think it's incredibly important. The court should be a place that looks like America, and judicial diversity enhances judicial decision making. We know that decisions are better when there are a variety of viewpoints being presented among the decision makers, and that is, I think, eminently true when it comes to the crucial, momentous decisions being rendered by the Supreme Court. And it also enhances public confidence in the court. We know from appellate courts across the country that when there is a greater diversity of judges, that's true. And so the fact that there is not a Black woman on the Supreme Court, I think, is a glaring error. And it's one that I'm delighted that President Biden is going to remedy. And the bench of Black women attorneys being considered by the administration, at least according to public reports, shows just how overdue this nomination is. There is an extraordinary pool of talent for the president to choose from. And so that makes me triply excited for this historic nomination, because it's long past time for a Black woman to be on the Supreme Court. And even if he hadn't said, frankly, during his campaign that this was his intention, all of these names would be on any shortlist for the Supreme Court.
And so the three frontrunners that we are talking about, would you agree, are Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, you mentioned her, on the D.C. Court of Appeals, Justice Leandra Kruger from the California Supreme Court, and Michelle Childs on the Federal District Court of South Carolina. Do you agree they're the three frontrunners? How do they stack up, and who's your favorite?
Well, I know well enough from being in this town and being involved in nominations that you can never say who's the front runner. You never know. Well, I never know. I'm sure President Biden and maybe a couple of folks in his inner circle know exactly who's on his short list. Although maybe he has an even broader list right now that he's considering, and he's narrowing it down during this time period. So I think it's very hard to say that those, particular three are the top three. Certainly they're in the mix, as they should be, because they're, incredibly talented and, well-credentialed folks with great reputations and have been certainly recommended well to the president. So I think that they are on the list. And, I continue to want to see, as I have with the lower court nominations that the president has made, someone who will be on the court who understands the way in which the law works for the people, as Justice Breyer said in his confirmation hearings, and perhaps just as important, the way the law doesn't work for people. We have this extraordinary promise of justice and equality and liberty in our Constitution, but for far too many people, that promise rings hollow. And we've seen that throughout history up to this current day. A lot of that does break down along racial lines because of the history of systemic racism in this country. And so I think having someone on the bench who understands that deeply from both professional and personal experience will be really groundbreaking for the Supreme Court. And I think long overdue and a very welcome change. So, I think having someone who understands that from maybe their own background or from their work, if someone who's been a civil rights lawyer, someone who's been in the public defender's office, someone who has represented people standing before the awesome power of the law, who might otherwise be incredibly powerless, and to be able to see in which the way the law can harm or benefit people, I think is something that's really important. And I'm really looking forward to seeing who the president picks, because like I said, he's done really a spectacular job with the lower court nominees thus far, who are the most diverse pool of lower court nominees to the bench, and just really great.
And getting a record number of them confirmed
Absolutely.
as well. So
Absolutely.
what is your response to those critics? And we hear them, of course, now, who say, look what Biden's doing. I mean, he's saying, I won't consider any white man at all, no matter how qualified. I won't consider any Asian American. I won't consider any Latino or Latina, just a black, not even a black man, only a black woman. What's your response?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most of the time that is, frankly, just not a particularly well-intentioned criticism. I think, that's really not what I think the criticism is aimed at. And honestly, before he made that statement, he could have been thinking about the fact that this pool of black women candidates are the strongest regardless of the search criteria that you use. And like I said, it's appropriate to think about courts looking like America. It's appropriate and frankly necessary to think about whether or not the true diversity of talent that we have in our country is represented on the courts. And the fact that there hasn't been a black woman nominee to the Supreme Court is not because there aren't incredibly talented black women attorneys out there who should have been considered, who should have been nominated. And so it's long past time for someone to make sure that they are intentional about that and make sure that we have a court that looks like America. I think it's been appropriate when other presidents have said, I want to make sure that we have perspectives represented, and I'm going to focus on a woman candidate.
Like Ronald Reagan did, right?
Yeah, and I think it's appropriate and necessary and about time.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.